Like, I mean, the executive order, President's executive order was 1,500 pages long. Most of it was commentary, didn't matter at all. And then it was boiled down to a summary of about 5 pages. And then included, let me see here, it included the major provisions of the final regulations and a resource for drafting the Title IX non-discrimination policies, notices of non-discrimination, and grievance procedures. The final regulations are effective August 1st, 2024. Okay. So, and then they have given you resources so you know how to protect yourselves against litigation, et cetera. It just seems to me that what are they trying to do? I don't understand it. So they've changed the wording from, there's a lot of the verbiage has changed, from actual to alleged, and harassment to non-discrimination. So does any of this increase opportunities for litigation against the school? Just wondering. But how does this improve the education of our students? I hope you'll enlighten me, because I do not understand this at all.
You have come to the right meeting, because we are going to have a significant presentation on that today. Any other people like to address the board? All right, then we are going to move on, and we have informational items from our new superintendent, David Bell.
Okay, I guess we'll get started. Make sure that works. Where am I pointing at, Amanda? At you? There we go. Okay, so for the report this month, I thought it would be smart to start with the superintendent entry plan. And so I've submitted that entry plan to the board. It's linked to the presentation, so anyone who wants to view that entry plan can have an opportunity to look at it. The slide deck here summarizes the key provisions to it. So the idea with transition is we're making sure that we're maintaining the continuity in our culture, sustaining the positive momentum that we have in the district, but we're also identifying opportunities for continuous district growth and improvement. So it's a good opportunity for us to hold ourselves accountable to the goals that we set in any type of transition. And so I've identified 4 goals to really focus on. And then for each goal, we have checkpoints throughout the year where I'll bring that information back to the board and we can have a conversation about the action steps that we've taken towards that and any adjustments that we want to make. So first goal is governance. So as I enter into this role, we want to make sure that we're supporting challenging, meaningful, engaging learning experiences by maintaining effective board governance. And so a big piece of that puzzle is making sure and ensuring we're having conversations about policy and making sure that the policy decisions that we make here guide the decisions that administrators and teachers and support staff make throughout the year. And so we'll talk a little bit about our goal to review the big policy guide that we have and make sure that we've got a plan, effective plan for monitoring that. A big piece is ensuring student success, and we have a strong strategic plan, fortunate to come in the middle of a strategic plan. And so what we'll do is create and have conversations about how we will monitor that strategic plan and really focusing on aligning resources, promoting collaboration, eliminating barriers, and really advocating for student growth for all of our students. Another piece with the entry plan is to solidify our organizational alignment. So leading the administrative structure, looking at the administrative structure, addressing system needs, and supporting the attainment of district and school goals, really leading that administrative team. And then the last piece is community engagement, and really looking and communicating with all stakeholder groups, finding ways to connect with students, staff, families, community in a transparent, open, collaborative, and sincere manner. And so those are good goals, but just like anything, we can have goals, but we probably have a way to monitor those. And so what I'd propose is that we'd monitor that entry plan at 30 days, 90 days, 180 days, and 360 days. Get feedback from the board to make sure we're on track. And if there's any modifications or adjustments that we want, it's also a chance for everybody to kind of follow and listen in on how we're doing. So that 30-day check-in will be today. It's 22 days, but I didn't want to be late. So 30-day check-in. So when we talk about governance, the first piece is to have the superintendent entry plan. So this in and of itself is part of that governance piece, is to make sure that the superintendent is communicating to the board that transition plan. The other piece that we're going to talk about is the policy review schedule. I know we've had conversations about that. Started some policy discussions, but we as an admin team have kind of looked at how can we systemically identify the policies that we're going to review and make sure that the community and you as the board know those policies and can understand the adjustments that are being made. The next piece is student success. We're going to talk a little bit about our strategic plan monitoring schedule. So we have a great strategic plan, and I think a really strong goal this summer has been for our admin team, and then ultimately, more than just our admin team, our teachers and support staff, having an opportunity to maybe look at how we're executing that strategic plan and prioritizing those goals. So we'll spend a little bit of time on that. And then for organizational alignment, the goal was to actually complete the admin recruitment. We're excited about that, and then supporting the onboarding of those new administrators. And then a little bit about communication and engagement. Again, that's an ongoing piece, but I want to highlight a few things that we've been able to do in the first few weeks, and then some future plans as well. So governance, there's a link to a doc that will be our monitoring doc, and it's a public doc. There are certain elements of the doc that are not public yet, the draft revisions. Those become public for you all once we have a draft that we would bring to a meeting to have discussion about. So we're working on those draft revisions, and then when they become available for you as the board, then they'll become available on this document. And so the idea with this doc, if we don't have to click into it, is it organizes all of the policies on one spreadsheet, and each spreadsheet has what the current policy is linked, so we know where we sit right now, when it was last revised, what the draft revision is, and again, that becomes live once we're at a point where we're going to talk about it, and then when the scheduled draft revision is. So the idea is we can become systemic, and everybody can kind of follow along on where we are with this project. And so if you're unfamiliar with policy handbooks, right, there are different series. There's the 100, 200, all the way through the 900 series. And the first two series, the 100 operations and 200 administration, those are policy reviews that we're prepared to bring to the board over the next 4 to 5 months. And so the goal would be to have our 100 operations series complete by the end of this calendar year, and the 200 series complete by the end of January. And so we're balancing a couple things. We're balancing the idea that we want to make sure that we're continuously looking at this and our policies don't become outdated. And so that means, hey, let's try to get as many done as we can so we can hit our target, against making sure that we're not just sort of jamming things through. So, hey, here's 47 policies. You guys have to read all of them in 1 month period of time. So we've really tried to look at that and find reasonable ways to do that. We seek support from legal counsel and WASB to look at our current policies and highlight some things that we want to make sure that we address with review. And so that's a really helpful aid, but ultimately the board is the deciding factor on policy adjustments. And so
somebody from WASB reviews all of them?
That's correct. Yep.
Wow. And do we contract for that, or is that part of our
Yep.
membership?
It's part of our membership. There's different layers to it, and so we didn't get like the super deluxe Cadillac version where they write us the entire policy, and other districts use something called Neola. We didn't do that. We feel like it's important for the district to engage in those conversations. So there's a review, making sure that there's compliance if there's a policy that we should add that we don't have, those types of things. So hundreds and 200s would come essentially right to the school board meeting, and we would have conversations in here about those updates, and we would hope to have that done by the end of January. For the 300 through 900 series, that policy review will start in a committee. It will start in personnel, ed programming, and finance and facilities. And so that will be our first opportunity to have conversation about what the policy updates will be. And then once that committee work is done, then it will come to the board, but we'll still have 2 readings at the full board meeting. So essentially, we'll have 3 opportunities to have conversation about those policies.
So for us, committee chairs, we can expect to be having new policy
Yep.
revisions on our agendas
Yep,
during that time.
that is correct. If you've had a chance to dig in, especially 300 and 400, there's a lot of policies, right? So the idea that we would be able to address every single policy and give it the time that it's really due doesn't work. So we're setting a goal of per series 8 to 12 policies. So some have less, so then there might be only the need to cover 8. Some have more, so we would try to get to 12.
And how often do we do that, policy review, or is it?
So we're setting the schedule here to, for the year, address in total 8 to 12 policies per series. So that, by my math, gets us a goal of about 60 policies in the 300 to 900 series that we would hopefully have updated by the end of this calendar, of this school year. Now, a couple things with that, right? So some policies, for example, some of our pupil non-discrimination policies that we'll talk about tonight, those are pretty intense, right? They take a long time. There's a lot of discussion that goes with them. And so we might, on a night where we're covering a heavy policy, only have one policy to review. There would be other times, some of the operations administration policies have been reviewed. They're compliant, they align to our current practices, so the updates will be less and we wouldn't require as much discussion.
It's a
But-
good
but-
way, I think especially as new people come on the board and you're doing these policies, it's a great way to get oriented.
But part of your question was, how often do we do this? We have not done it as regularly in the past, I think, right?
Yep.
Which is why maybe there's a few more to do right now. But will this put us on a regular cycle now to
Yep.
always be reviewing it?
Right, so go ahead.
Excuse me, I think it's a bit more accurate to say that we've been reviewing things as the need has arisen, but every so often it's a really good idea to stop and take stock of everything, and that's what we're doing now.
It's not that we haven't been reviewing them. There
Right.
hasn't been a calendar with a
Right.
series like this.
Right.
So that's our governance goal, and so what I wanted to put out in the first 30 days is the plan, right? That's the easy part, right? The plan is the easy part. The execution will be a little bit trickier, and so we will monitor, we'll do a check-in at different points to kind of demonstrate how far we are, but this policy discussion will become a part of what we're talking about.
And we are a policy-driven board. Most boards are, but not all boards, really. But if you're going to have policies, they need to be updated, but they also need to be reviewed by legal counsel, which is why we're doing this, because it protects the district, protects kids, and makes sure that we're actually saying what it is we wanted to say. So part of what legal counsel is just not protect the district. That's not the only reason we bring them in, is does this say what you want it to say, and is it effective? So that's the reason we would bring in legal counsel.
Okay, so the next goal is student success. And kind of the one part that I wanted to touch on is the concept of strategic plan monitoring. And if you leave with four big things from this section, it's that we've got a lot to celebrate in the district. And a lot of that work starts with, for the board, with mission, vision, and strategic planning. And one thing that we're really attempting to do this year is close that execution gap, right? So there's a lot of things within the strategic plan, and we want to move from having the idea of what the strategic plan is into executing that. And with that comes prioritization. And so if we're prioritizing, we're really looking at lots of different data points and stakeholder feedback to guide us to what's the most important thing and how we would prioritize our time and resources. So the strategic plan is great, but if we're going to move forward, we have to kind of have a systemic way that we're going to address that and communicate what are our most important goals. So lots to celebrate. Pulled this off of the website to identify all of the different activities our students have to grow socially, emotionally, academically. It's really a fantastic place to be. If you have an opportunity to be in the schools on a day-to-day basis, you see the relationships that are created. Those are all wonderful things. There's a ton to celebrate. And one thing is we owe it to all of the students and parents and our teachers to be focused on continuously improving. So we don't just rest on what we celebrate now, but we continue to grow. And so when we say, well, where do we want to grow? That's our strategic plan, that's our mission and vision, and that's our values. And so this is a document that you've seen quite a bit, and it's still rooted in the planning that's taking place with our administrative team this summer. And then when they go out and they have their planning sessions with their support staff and teachers, they're using that same model. So you've seen these goals: high expectations for student learning, 5 sub-goals; a safe, welcoming environment, 6 sub-goals; attracting and retaining high-quality teachers and staff, 6 more sub-goals; and the life readiness, 4 sub-goals; upholding operational excellence, 5 sub-goals. So that's great, right? I feel like over 5 years, it's legitimate to say we can address 5 goals and 34 sub-goals. I think that's a legitimate thing. However, it can be overwhelming if you don't have a disciplined way that you look at and prioritize those goals. And so one thing that we're engaging in right now is trying to make it less overwhelming and have a disciplined planning process within our district. And when we say within the district, we mean at the district level, in our departments like academic services, human resources, and finance and facilities, and then at the school level as well. So hopefully we can adopt kind of a common way that we are addressing and setting goals within our district. And so we won't spend too much time on this. We have at our board retreat had some of these same themes, but the ideas that we have are based on the work of Sean Covey, and those 4 disciplines are starting with focusing on what is most important, and the concept that if you have too many priorities, you really don't have any priorities, and being very specific and measurable with what your targets are. The second discipline is really acting on your lead measures, looking at things within your circle of influence that can impact your goal areas. And if we are focusing on things that are outside of our sphere of influence, that's really just frustrating and not productive. The next discipline is making sure we're keeping a compelling scoreboard that we share widely. And we share it widely, not about blaming and shaming, not about getting up and having conversations about what kids can't do, but sharing widely and putting on top of the table where we are at as a district and where we want to go. And the last discipline is creating accounts of accountability. That starts here at the board level. It starts in administrative team meetings. It starts with school and department meetings, and it continues into the classroom. And so when we talk about a cadence of accountability, what we're just saying is regular, repeated, and predictable. The board can expect we're going to provide updates on the strategic plan. They're going to understand the data that we're using. They're going to understand the steps that we're taking, the lead measures that we're taking. So there's conversations that are taking place at the board level, and then the board can also trust that those same conversations are happening at the admin level and other departments within the district. So really quickly, what do we mean by too many priorities? Means no priorities. I already touched on that. So, okay, great. Dave, do you just pick the most priority areas? No. We have a discipline process where we're looking at data. We're looking at stakeholder feedback. We did a stakeholder survey in the spring. We looked a lot of that data. When we say stakeholder, we had parent feedback, student feedback, and then employee feedback as well. There's a lot of academic attendance benchmarks that we can use. And really the process here is what's most worth closing, what gap is most worth closing, what's most critical to our success, and what's most aligned to the strategic plan. So those are the areas that we're really looking at. And so far, we're not done yet. I don't have our most wildly important goals right now, but what I can tell you is the data and feedback are zeroing in on 3 big areas. And this isn't gonna be like, oh my gosh, fall off your chair, there's a new thing here. It's academic growth, right? We learn in this school district. It's student engagement, we make connections, and it's employee satisfaction. It's a great place to work. And so if we're focusing our school and department goals on very specific targeted goals within those areas, and we're focusing on what's in our circle of influence, we feel like we can better execute our strategic plan. And so when we talk about being specific, like people talk about SMART goals, and we want to even be smarter than that. We want to be very clear. This is our current situation. This is where we're at, and this is where we want to be by 2027, because that is where that's when our strategic plan will be renewed. And so we're gonna set big goals here too. And so we believe in the growth. We believe in our students. We believe in our employees. And so by setting those big goals, we understand we might not get all the way there by 2027, but we feel there's value in really pushing the envelope there. So I talked a little bit about acting on lead measures, and just as this concept here of, we dig into at the board level a lot of lag data, and that's data that like school report cards, forward data, ACT data, and I'll say that's super important data, right? We value that. We look at it very closely. But if you look only at that in isolation, without identifying lead measures, commitments that we can do to influence that change, it's really frustrating and it's ineffective. If we plop ACT data in front of teachers and we say, this isn't good enough, and we don't take the next conversation piece to say, what can we do within our control? What can we influence to impact that change? We're really missing a big piece. And so some of the language that we're focusing on right now is how do we create an environment where we're committing to lead measures that will impact our areas that maybe we would say is lag data. And so I think there's probably some people in this room that are sick of seeing this graphic because we've talked about it a lot. But the point of the matter is, if you want to impact a lag measure, then you want to do things as a school district that are in that lever point, in that lead measure point. And so you should be picking things that are predictive of making change to the lag measure, and that you can influence, right? If one of those things is missing, that becomes problematic for actually influencing change. So if you say, well, we should do X, Y, and Z, and X, Y, and Z are out of our influence of control, well, then that's not really going to be an effective thing. Or we should do, A, B, and C, but that's not really predictive of change, then that's problematic as well. So a quick specific example that we've talked about just to kind of continue conversations from last year is when we talk about academic growth for students, we should be really laser focused on these 3 areas. We should be laser focused on ensuring a guaranteed and viable curriculum for all of our students, that we should be ensuring that our teachers are collaborating around that curriculum authentically, having good, meaningful conversations, and we should be implementing high-quality, research-based, proven strategies that are effective. And if we focus our efforts on those things, then lag measures, like academic growth, should come for all students. We should keep a compelling scorecard. And so why do we do that? We do that to understand where we're going, how we know if we've actually got somewhere, if we're making progress. How do we examine our programs and systems to ensure that they're effective? And it creates that mindset of continuous improvement. It's not about blame or shame. We're not going to get up here and compare elementary school A to elementary school B. And we're not going to have personally identifiable information even down to the school. What we're really looking at is growth and having a conversation about where we're at. So one thing you will see, I'm not going to go through this in great detail, but the team has been working together on a scorecard for the district level. And so what we talk about here will be a combination of what are our most wildly important goals at the department level and school level. Those are kind of more in that lead measure side of things. And we'll also talk about lag measures as well. So we're holding ourselves accountable. So as we're looking at both the lead measures, the commitments, and then the result of those. So you will see a final scorecard for the district, for the board to review and approve in September. And we're doing it September. It'll actually be near the end of September. And the reason we're doing it near the end of September is that gives it a chance for it to not be the administrative team scorecard. It's going to be all of the people who will have an impact on the data points on there having a say on it. And so then the last piece is accountability. And so we talk about accountability at all levels. For the school board, we'll bring to you in September a final monitoring calendar, and that will give you some information on where the different scorecard elements will be presented to you and shared with you. So there's different elements within that scorecard of which on a regular basis, the part of what we talk about here will be reporting back on how things are going. So whether that's an elementary school talking about their wildly important goal, or the personnel committee talking about our staff retention rate, or finance and facilities talking about a budget forecast or facilities planning, all those things will be part of our scorecard, and you will know when those things will be taking place. So that's a lot of the work that we've been focusing on, and it's really zeroed in on that student success piece. Are there questions on that?
All that in 22 days, Dave. Good job.
Yeah. Don't judge me if the next one's not quite as long. So then the next piece then, just to give the final update, organizational alignment, we have Rachel Mader hired as our new West Side principal. She's not here today, but Mary Beth Elliott and Amy Wise are here. They're our co-directors of academic services. We're very excited to have them on board. I think everybody in this room, even our visitors, know Mary Beth and Amy, and we talked a little bit about them last time as well. We'll do a full, like in our next HR update, as well as newsletters at Westside. We'll do a full update on introducing them. Both of them have some familiarity with River Falls School District, so we're really excited about that transition. And then the last piece, communication and engagement. This is Amanda's favorite slide because her picture's on it. We've been doing some things to update. You'd be surprised how many things you have to update just to get names correct and all those things. So we're working on that, especially with DPI. Yeah. Right, Amanda? That's a lot of fun. But we've also had some initial community conversations and connections with the Forward Foundations, UWRF, and other community organizations. And a big piece of this engagement planning is working with Jenny Ames to have some guiding principles for all stakeholders on communications and coming up with ideas to connect and new ideas and hanging on to the great work that's already happening. Okay, that is all for my update.
Thank you very much. Any questions or comments from the board? B.
Okay, so B is a notice around preliminary agendas in newspapers. And so what we run into is we want to stay committed to publishing our agendas in the local newspapers, but their deadlines are pretty far.
15 days.
15 days before the actual meeting. And so what can happen sometimes is we maybe need to make some agenda adjustments, and we wanted to make sure that somebody who read the paper knew that that might happen. And so what we're recommending is this language would be in every published agenda that we put into both of the newspapers. It would just say the preliminary agenda is prepared early in order to meet publication timelines for area newspapers. Changes to the agenda may occur. If so, those changes will appear within 24 hours, and it gives the location on our webpage where you can do that. We also update the postings, because that's the difference between posting and publishing. So we feel like that stays that commitment of really meeting our commitment to publishing this information, but also making sure that published information is as accurate as possible.
Dave, what's the likelihood that we're going to make changes? I mean, the likelihood in 15 days out, it's pretty good there's going to be some changes, in it, right?
That's nodding. Yeah, there are changes that can occur.
And sometimes they're very small, but
Yep.
sometimes there aren't any, but.
Well, I'm just wondering if changes to the agenda may occur, well, may likely occur. That would prompt someone to say, why don't you just assume that there's some changes in there? I don't
I
know.
don't think it's on a regular enough basis that we do changes. I would say maybe one every couple months.
I
You have to
agree.
add something or
Okay,
take
all right.
something off, but I don't think it's.
Yeah, these are both committee meetings and full board meetings, right?
Yep.
So it's like all-
Yep.
Because committee meetings are often coming together the week before.
Right.
Oh, that's why I'm
Yeah,
wondering.
And the law wants to ensure that the public has proper notice.
Yeah, and so the publishing is something that by policy, we're committed to do, but really the posting is the key thing. Yep, and so, but the other piece is, to your point, we just want people to know
Yeah.
what's being talked about.
Right.
I would say when there's like a full agenda item that isn't on there and then it's added, that's rare, that's not an everyday thing. We kind of have an idea what the agenda will be, but sometimes enough where we want to make sure that people have noticed that it could happen, we have it there.
Okay.
So this is not an action item. This is really simply notifying the board that this is the intent of administration. Anything else on that? All right, then we're going to move on to action items. And at this point, we have the meeting minutes from the June 24th regular Board of Education meeting. We have bills that have been submitted for payment. We also have employment recommendations. So is there a motion to approve minutes, bills, and employment as presented? Thank
Second.
you, Lindsay. Thank you, Alan. Questions or comments? All those in favor? Aye. Opposed? The motion is carried. Thank you. We will move on to a report and recommendations from the Educational Program Committee, and Alan.
We had a good meeting and a lot of good, really good conversation. Both Mary Beth and Amy were there. Welcome them. Nate still led the academic services part of it for the board because he's had the history of dealing with this, and he'll help us with this tonight as well. I think what we'll do is we will take items, item one, we'll talk about academic standards and present that for approval. And then if it's okay with you, we'll take items 2 through 7, which we've had pretty good conversation about. Take those as one motion, if
Yes.
that works. So the first is academic standards, public notice. We talked about that. That's an annual thing. It's basically telling everyone, putting it out there, here are the standards we adhere to. We adhere to the Wisconsin state standards and that. Nate, can you want to give us a
Yeah,
thumbnail on that?
that's a really good summary. Each year in the month of July, all school districts have to adopt the standards that they're going to use to guide how teachers will develop their instruction and what the aims are for the students at all of the grade levels in the school. So our standards are, for the most part, entirely the Wisconsin state standards, but we do have a couple national standards woven into that because it allows for sometimes greater breadth and depth of those standards.
Okay. I'll move that we approve the academic standards as presented and what we talked about at our committee meeting. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you, Allison. Any discussion? Thanks, Nate, for your work on that and keeping us in compliance. All those in favor? Aye. Opposed? The motion is carried.
Then items 2 through 7, and I'll also move their adoption. These are handbook updates, just like we're doing policy reviews and updating our policies. Each year, we do a review of handbooks. A year ago, we did a really thorough review, but there's always changes that need to happen, as well as the athletic activities handbook. And this year, the REN is in there, and all of that. So that's in there. I think, Nate, we had some suggestions for some minor revisions, and those have been included in what we have. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yep.
So, anyway, I moved.
So you've made that motion. Is there a second? Second. Thank you, Lindsay. Questions or comments?
A lot of work went into this. Really appreciate the work that was done on this. And the presentations we had in committee, very good.
So please extend our appreciation to the principals and the people who worked on it. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? The motion is carried. Thank you. Mike is not able to be with us this evening because he's not feeling 100%. And so in his absence, Lynette is going to give us the update from the Finance and Facilities Committee, and then she'll also outline the recommended actions.
Thank you, Stacy. Finance meeting, initially, we went over an internal controls presentation and talked about the internal controls we have in the finance department. A couple of the key, I think, things I wanted to emphasize through that was that, yes, we have an audit, which is part of our internal controls, but that isn't, when people think of that audit, it's often, I think people think of an audit as something that's meant to catch any fraud or misappropriations or anything, and that's really not the main goal of our audit. The main goal is to make sure that we are coding all of our revenues and expenditures in accordance with accounting practices, standard accounting practices, and also with the Wisconsin uniform accounting as well. So it's called WOOFR is the acronym for that. So that's some of the main goals of our audit. But we have a lot of internal controls. If you're interested, that presentation is available, and you can review those. We also went over the 2023-24 budget update, and that was through May. So we're always like a month behind. But we did talk about kind of how we were going to be finishing the year, or at least where I was seeing things finishing out at the end of June. And then we talked about the other items up for recommendation, the fiscal year-end fund balance designations and the Fund 46 transfer. Do you want me to go over those now or when we get to those approval items?
Well, are there any questions or comments about the summary? I think we were all there. So
Yeah, and then we had
most of
a
us.
design and planning team
Yep.
for the referendum projects. We went over kind of where things are at with that, and they're moving along really nicely.
So why don't you give us the background, please,
Okay.
about number one?
Yeah, so you did have some updated, if you remember at the finance meeting, I said there's still things happening, and there still are things happening in our books as we close out the year. So you do have an updated fund balance designation and percentages document. Again, I always put the caveat there that it's still an estimate, I put the caveat that it's unaudited, so as we move through our audit, there may still be some adjustments made. We talked about what the restricted doesn't require board action, but I like to keep that on this list as well. That restricted of the $46,000 includes our common school funds that we carry over every year, and then the Get Kids Ahead grant that districts all got for 2 years. We do have a deadline to spend all of that by December? Thank you. By the end of the calendar year. So we're still carrying those funds forward, and we have a plan to spend those out. It was part of mental health, yes. So somewhat related, but also it was focused on mental health services. So those are the remaining funds for both of those. Then we have the assigned, which is the required it requires board approval for us either committed or assigned fund balance. And what we have here, a little bit of an update from last week. We are asking for approval for $470,000 for 8877 for our school bus and classroom furniture that were budgeted in 23-24. And as we discussed, even though we ordered the bus back in September, I believe, we're not expecting it until December of this year. So well over a year later. So we need to carry those forward as assigned. And then also some of our classroom furniture. We've been working with all of our buildings to, well, besides the Montessori, because they are very well updated, to update some of the classroom furniture in our buildings. So many of those purchases were done near the end of the year, end of the fiscal year, and because they haven't come on site yet, we need to move those funds forward to pay out in this new fiscal year. So what that brings us to is an unassigned fund balance. I would say this is within our policy, which is 25 to 30%. Again, still estimates as we finish these out. And you'll see those final numbers once the audit is finished. So asking for approval of those fund balance designations.
Thank you, Allison. Is there a second? Thank you, Lindsay. Questions or comments? All those in favor? Aye. Opposed? The motion is carried. And now could you explain to us, please, about the Fund 46 transfer?
Right, so the other document you have is really a fund balance history at year end. Also includes what we just reviewed for designations, and then also adds.
Yeah.
Also adds a couple other line items, which shows our transfers to Fund 46 over the history of that fund. Just to clarify, Fund 46 is also called our capital, now I'm blanking.
Our sinking fund.
Capital Improvement Fund, I think is how it's designated. So once funds are moved over to Fund 46, they can be spent only on what is part of your 10-year capital plan. And we approved that last month. We have our 10-year capital plan. Again, it's a working, living document. We can add to it, we can change it. But when you're ready to spend the funds out of 46, it must match up with what you have approved by the board in that capital plan. The funds can't be moved back. So once they are moved to Fund 46, they can't be moved back and used for operating expenses. So you can see the history there starting in 17-18. And just in 23-24, we had a balance of about $650,000, which was spent down. So now this transfer that we're asking for approval for $1,050,000 will actually replenish that. So that will essentially be our new balance in Fund 46. Contributions to Fund 73, and I add all of this on here just so you can see in total. I think they all play into each other as far as our total fund balance, because those contributions to Fund 73 also come from the general fund. And so that's kind of what I was talking about last week, that although we were talking last week about a $600,000 transfer, I said it's going to kind of depend on where we end up with those Fund 73 contributions. And one of the things we did a little bit differently this year is rather than making a large transfer or wire from Fund 10, when we're contributing to Fund 73 for active employees and then they resign, they forfeit the funds that are in that account. And that forfeiture balance has just been building and building. So instead, we used that balance, which has not been part of our cash balance. It's been with Mid-America. So we essentially said, move those funds from our forfeiture account to help with the contribution to Fund 73. So we didn't make as large of a transfer from our general fund for that. And so that helped, that contributed to sort of where we are in total fund balance. And then the 624 that you see here for a contribution to Fund 73 is the required actuarially determined contribution. So we have an actuarial report done every year, and they make a recommendation to keep your Fund 73 properly funded. And at the end of last fiscal year, we were slightly overfunded there, so there's really no reason at this point to make any additional contributions. So that is right in line with the ADC.
Lynette, just for people who don't listen to this every day, who are watching on TV or in the audience, can you just repeat what Fund 73 and what Fund 46 are?
Yeah, so Fund 46 is our capital improvement fund. When the funds are transferred from Fund 10 to Fund 46, they have to stay there and be used from there. They can't be transferred back. They have to be used for us. Yes, they are also counted in your shared cost or expenses for that fiscal year, which is then used to calculate your state aid for next year.
So there's a benefit coming back to us.
There is. Again, we've talked about how we're aided, and we actually lose aid at that higher level. So we still need to at least be aware. There's not much we can do about it, but we need to be aware of our expenses, and that if we're going to continue, if we're going to make a large expenditure, that could actually reduce our aid a little bit. And then Fund 73 is OPEB, or Other Post-Employment Benefits, is what that stands for. So those are essentially our retirement account, so our retirement benefits. So the recommendation tonight, we're asking for approval for the transfer to Fund 46 in the amount of $1,050,000.
Is there a motion for that, please? Allison, thank you. Is there a second?
Second.
Okay. Questions or comments?
I would just add on to Allison's comment, because looking at this can get really confusing, and it'd be real easy for someone to misconstrue this. If anybody watching this or has questions of us about this, I would suggest that they contact Lynette directly to clarify this, because it may not sound logical, but it's the way we have to do it in the state. So we want to be very transparent and remind everybody that Lynette's available to help explain this to anyone who has questions. So,
Any further discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? The motion is carried. Thank you again, Lynette, for the internal controls presentation. I think it was really helpful, and it's confidence inspiring for us and for the community to understand the careful systems that you and your staff have in place to ensure fiscal integrity. So thank you.
Yeah, and I think one of the other things we hit on was the board's responsibility in
We
that
did.
as well. So that's really important, to keep asking the questions. And
I was just going to say that, and you gave us permission to ask you any of
Yes.
those questions that we have, so. All right, then the Personnel Committee met the same day. It was a marathon, and during that meeting, we received a certified staffing update from David Bell. We also approved recommendations for the employment handbook. There were some revisions for the 2024 year. We also then approved the Safety and Crisis Response Program Assistant. These are some job descriptions. Some of them were for the most part really very minor, and I will outline those when we get to the recommended action. As well as, the Student Services and the Finance and Facilities Program Assistant. And then we talked about the Speed and Strength Program Assistant job description, which is different. So we'll get to that once we make the motions. So is there a motion to approve the 2024-25 employee handbook revisions? Thank you, Lindsay. A second?
Second.
Thank you, Allison. Questions or comments? All those in favor? Aye. Opposed? The motion is carried. And maybe, Dave, you would like to add into this, but I'm going to take numbers 2 and 3 together. They are not new positions. There's no increase in staffing for these positions. It's simply a job title change. So really very minor. Do you want to add anything else? Okay. So at this point, is there a motion to approve the Safety and Crisis Response Program Assistant job description as well as the Academic Services, Student Services, and Finance and Facilities Program Assistant job descriptions. Thank you, Allison. Is there a second? Second. Thank you, Bo. Questions or comments? All those in favor? Aye. Opposed? The motion is carried. And the final recommended action is the Speed and Strength Program Assistant job description. This is a new position, but it replaces purchase services they're services that we use to purchase, and so it's really a shift. So at this point, I will make the motion to approve the Speed and Strength Program job description. Is there a second? Second. Thank you, Alan. Do you want to add anything, Dave?
Just that with that last purchase service piece, we made an intentional decision to take a step back from requiring students to pay for ETS services during the summer and during the school year. And we've seen an increase in participation over the summer, which will help our overall summer school numbers, which will increase some state aid. But really, that decision was made to increase access to our speed and strength programs for students who are maybe considering participating in a sport, or maybe they aren't even in a sport but just want to do that now there isn't the barrier of the cost that's associated with it. So just wanted to make sure that we're moving away from ETS, but because of that, there is some shifting in priorities.
It's a good thing, and we've heard positive response from families. Anything else? All those in favor? Aye. Opposed? The motion is carried. And for E, I will turn over to you, Dave, to explain this, please.
So last year, we suspended our K-8 virtual e-school, and that was a decision that was made based on enrollment and overall funding concerns. Where we are now is that was a suspension, and we've made the decision when we look at our goals and where we're headed is to make that K-8 virtual e-school a permanent decision to officially close that virtual school program. So no change in opportunities between the 23-24 school year and beyond, because we had already made that decision. So our K-8 virtual program, we're ending that virtual program. And what that would mean then is if the board accepts it, if we decided we did want to do a K-8 program, we'd have to go through the process of restarting that as a charter school. We're comfortable with that because if we make that decision, we would want to do that anyways.
Mm-hmm. So is there a motion to approve the administrative recommendation to officially close the K-8 virtual school program? Thank you, Lindsay. Is there a second? Thanks, Allison. It was important for a time in our district's life, but that's run its course. All those in favor? Aye. Opposed? The motion is carried. And now we are going to turn to a presentation about the updates to Title IX. Dave and Mark are going to do this, and I'm just going to tell the board, or ask you please, they have a very specific presentation. They are going to stop every so often for questions, and so let's not interrupt. Let's just wait until we get to the point where they have questions. I've gone through it now. I've gone through it once, and it's a well-done presentation, but your question might be answered in the next statement, so.
Okay, so a couple broad things. So why are we doing this? Well, we're doing this in response to the approval of the 2024 Title IX amendments. And so we've got a plan of attack to provide some background information so the board understands the ins and outs of Title IX and the hows and whys of why we're focused on updating this policy. We have some sections that we will talk about how that will not be impacted by these new amendments, and other sections that may be impacted by the amendments. Our legal counsel has reviewed it, and we feel confident that we're in a place to have a first reading. And just like any other policy, we will engage in conversation. We'll sit with it, and then we'll come back for a second reading before it becomes fully approved. And we feel very comfortable even with where the regulations are at with that process, and the legal counsel agrees with us.
David, I wonder, in response to the questions about why are we talking about this anyway, and what was wrong with the old Title
Sure.
IX policy?
We can go through that. Yep.
And you'll go through that
Yep.
at the 20,000 foot level of
Yeah, we might even
Might
we might
be a
even skim
little
down
lower.
a little bit. We'll get a little closer. Yeah. So. Yeah. So the first piece, starting the broad piece, is that we have policies that prohibit discrimination. To zero the board in, a couple of those policies are 411 and 511, which address equal opportunities both in employment and for our students. I put a link there to our 411 policy, and that is kind of all forms of discrimination, including sex discrimination. And so one thing we're addressing today is that we're not recommending adjustments to either of those policies tonight. We may come back after we've updated the Title IX non-discrimination policies and do some cleanup to make sure that the language is aligned in these policies, but we really don't see any need to update the policies as they are written right now based on Title IX. The district can choose to engage in policy updates anytime it wants, but based on the Title IX amendments, we don't see a reason to have to change 411 or 511. Okay, so discrimination is prohibited. So unfortunately, there are times when we get a report, complaint, or other notice of discrimination within the district. And so we have specific complaint procedures that take us through the process of addressing that concern, kind of guiding the process that goes through when that happens. And so the first thing is, if the complaint is not related to sex discrimination, that's really not a Title I issue. Doesn't mean it's not important. It just means that we have a different set of complaint procedures that we go through. And those complaint procedures are outlined in Policy 411, Rule 1, Student Discrimination Complaint Procedures. That is the step-by-step process that guides the district to resolving the complaint. We're not making any recommended adjustments to that policy at this time. Again, we might have to do some cleanup for alignment's sake, but we see that policy as being aligned to the rules and requirements that we need to investigate complaints of discrimination. It doesn't mean it's an absolutely airtight, perfect policy, but we feel like it allows the district to engage in a process to meet a resolution of the complaint, and it allows the person making the complaint to have multiple opportunities to engage in that process. So what if the complaint is related to sex discrimination, including sexual harassment? So the broad sex discrimination, and then maybe the little more specific sexual harassment. So what happens then is our Title IX coordinator is responsible for determining if the complaint should be investigated through Title IX specific complaint procedures, or if there's other applicable district procedures that go with it. And so the 41111, one of the policies that we'll look at today, guides the Title IX coordinator in making that determination. So there's specific definitions, specific ways to interpret, to understand if the complaint should be investigated as a sex non-discrimination situation in which Title IX applies. If the answer to that is yes, if the Title IX coordinator uses that policy and says this complaint, this notice, this concern does fit under these definitions, then the process that we will use to investigate that complaint procedure is the Title IX 41111 rule, non-discrimination complaint procedures. And the regs update some of the elements of how we're supposed to go through that process. If the Title IX coordinator looks at the complaint and concern and says, this doesn't meet the standard for a Title IX discrimination complaint, it doesn't mean we just say, oh, no biggie, good luck, and move on. We have other district procedures that guide the process to resolving that complaint, code of conduct, other policies that are in play. So I think the first piece to say from taking a step back is the district is compelled to have policies that prohibit discrimination. What we're really talking about today is one form of that discrimination, which is sex discrimination, and the complaint procedure process we will use if the complaint falls under Title IX. I have to use this thing. All right, Mark.
All right, so just to give you a little bit of background, and I don't have like the exact reason why the government decided to do some of these updates, but I have some good reasons. So Title IX, as you know, started way back in 1972, all about prohibiting sex discrimination in any sort of program that received federal funding. Since then, it's been updated a number of times. 2020 was kind of the last major revision up until this April. In 2020, that was probably a very large update that it gave us a whole bunch of policies and procedures on how we needed to kind of go through the grievance process. But in doing that, they were, very prescriptive in some things, and there wasn't some definitions. So when you look at the new amendments, some of the things that were kind of beneficial is they've added a little bit of flexibility, in particular for some of our smaller districts where there's certain rules or roles that are required, where a small district might not have enough people to fulfill all those rules. So it allows some flexibility in people covering multiple rules. You'll see that it provides a lot of definitions as well. So in the past amendment or the past changes, there was a lot of things mentioned, but they really didn't define them. So there's a lot of nice definitions kind of adding to the equation as far as what that looks like. So again, this April was kind of when the final definitions or a final amendment was published. That might seem like that's a little bit of time between now and then, but it really isn't. WASB and a lot of the organizations have really been working on trying to identify exactly what this means. Jackie mentioned there's a couple of guidance documents that they put out that we've been referencing. Dave, Nate, and I have been meeting. We've consulted with legal counsel on trying to get this as right as possible based on the information that we know. So I think, as Dave mentioned, we think we're in a pretty darn good place as far as kind of what our policy looks like. It might come back that there might be a few little tweaks we need to make, and if that's the case, we will come back to you with some of those adjustments. So really, it's all about taking us and kind of looking at the 2024 amendments, putting those into practice, and then getting those on our policy updates. Again, any district who accepts federal funding is required to adopt these policies. Dave will talk in a little bit about the one small little exception based on some legal stuff that's going on. He'll talk about that in a second, but we are not part of that, so that does not apply to us.
Yeah, so we say, well, what kind of federal funding does the district receive? Well, the largest levels of aid come from our state aid and our local tax levy. The federal funding is in third place, but I would say it's a distant third place. Somewhere between 5% and 8% of our funding each year is federal funding, and I think the two biggest rocks of that are special ed IDEA funding, which supports our special education program, as well as Title I funding, which supports some early intervening services in literacy and math for our students. So if the district were to not comply with Title IX and the regulations associated with it, there would be some risk for accessibility to those federal funds. Now, what I will say is that in the immediate, that's not going to be something that, if we choose to take one extra month or whatever, we're not going to immediately lose that federal funding. But the federal government will not be okay with us not aligning our processes and practices to Title IX. Okay, so a couple of related items. On July 2nd, 2024, the Department of Education was enjoined by federal government orders from enforcing the 2024 regulations in the states that are listed there. It has to do with some lawsuits associated with the new regulations. I'll get into some specifics of what those lawsuits are, but essentially if we were in one of those states, we may not be coming to you at this point for updates. We may be waiting to see if that takes place. We had a conversation, what takes place from that situation. The district legal counsel that we had a conversation with recommended moving forward with the adoption of these policies because that injunction doesn't enjoin River Falls School District. So it is his recommendation that we move forward with these updates. And as you'll see, while there's a lot of language to these updates, there isn't some huge fundamental changes as well. So what's the injunction about? Well, it's primarily about the expanded definition of sex in Title IX. And so the definition of sex in Title IX includes sex discrimination based on sex stereotypes, sex characteristics, pregnancy, or related condition. And so that expanded definition of sex is now all covered under Title IX, so anyone who fits into those categories could potentially make a discrimination claim. So in Wisconsin, that definition, that more broad definition, and the obligations to not discriminate against people based on those discriminations already exists in Wisconsin case law because of Whitaker versus Kenosha Unified School District. This is a case in which a transgender student made a Title IX sex discrimination claim and was successful in that claim. And so that and our own policy 411 mean that we already have that more expanded definition of sex. Are there any questions on that?
Just so I'm following this, we're updating this because we're required to have a policy in place. So we have to have it. It needs to be updated. We're updating it. And we're doing it in conjunction with legal counsel to make sure it's legal. So why do we even have one? We're required to have one.
Yeah, and ultimately, we're required to have a process in which we would identify what is sex discrimination, and then a process if we have notice of sex discrimination, what are we going to do to investigate it? That's the piece. So we've always had something like that, and now starting in 2020 and now in 2024, they've gotten more specific and sort of prescribed in what that looks like.
Okay. And our legal counsel is brought in here to make sure that we're doing exactly what the current case law is, and that's a little bit up in the air. I think we talked about this at an earlier board meeting too, is based on what's happening in those other states, and the court case in Wisconsin could always change with another court case.
Well,
So, yeah, so I think the point you're bringing up, Alan, is this idea of a subsequent court case that might change the scope or definition of Title IX. And if that were in Wisconsin, then the district would have to respond and make a decision on if it were going to update its policy. And our practice normally is to stay in line with case law.
But we can't go do our own thing if it's in conflict with
Correct.
Wisconsin or federal
Yep.
state law.
Yep.
Sure. And weren't some of the decisions or some of the changes this year were made to reverse changes that were made in 2020? There were certain changes put in place that.
We'll get to that.
Okay.
I don't think it's in direct reversal. I think it's more, we'll get to it.
Okay.
How's that? So Title IX, another related item that can come up is just this idea of, do these regulations govern the eligibility for gender-specific athletic teams? And the answer is no. There's some viewpoint that the department might come back with a separate rule, but what we're talking about here doesn't pertain to that in any way. Our policy is that all students will be able to participate in school-sponsored athletics in accordance with WAA policy, procedures, and guidelines. So there's some specific, very prescribed guidelines related to transgender participation. And specifically, when we're talking about a male to female transition, there's some very specific rules associated with that. Okay, so now for this part, Mark and I thought it would be a good idea if you had your policy in front of you, because we're going to talk about the notable changes and then reference where they are in the policy. So we'll kind of say page 1 and all of that. So we have the blue policy is the 411.11 Title IX sex non-discrimination. So I'll just address the first piece, which is the name of the policy. So the name of the policy before was specific to sexual harassment, and now it's expanded to all forms of sex discrimination or sex non-discrimination. And so now this is we are potentially expanding how we would use these complaint procedures. We wouldn't use just the complaint procedures if it were a claim of harassment. We could also use these complaint procedures if it was a claim of discrimination. We had an employee of the district who was by sex discriminating against one gender over the other. We could use the complaint procedures for that. Okay.
Yeah, so as Dave said, I'm going to just talk through some notable changes. You'll have your policy in front of you, and we'll kind of reference that as we go. I won't go line by line or word by word, or we'd be here until about 1 o'clock. You will notice that there is a lot of yellow, as well, maybe not yellow on your non-colored copy, but there's a lot of highlighting, and there's a lot of strike-throughs. And it might look a little overwhelming as you're looking at it, but as Dave mentioned before, there is not a lot of substantive changes to like the nuts and bolts of what we do. We will talk through a few things that are kind of expansions, and we will talk through a few other things. But when we get to like grievance procedures and those kind of things, a lot of this stuff we were already doing. So as Dave said, probably one of the bigger things, and when I say bigger, it might be bigger for some districts who hadn't already kind of used their 411 policy to kind of talk about kind of the definition of sex. But in Title IX, the scope of sex discrimination is expanded to talk a little bit about those things Dave mentioned earlier: sex stereotypes, sex characteristics, pregnancy and related conditions, sexual orientation, and gender identity. Again, that is already in Policy 41111, the main one. So this is just matching our policy with the other policy that we currently have, which again is based on Wisconsin's Seventh Circuit law. I forget the Whitaker versus Kenosha. So again, adding this language to our policy to make it consistent across the board. So again, I don't see this as being a major change to kind of the nuts and bolts of what we do. The next one, and this is on pages 1 and 2 of Policy 41111.
The blue.
The blue, yep, the blue. And this is really some expansion and some definitions around what Title IX sexual harassment includes. Before we had a lot of this same language, but we didn't have the definitions. So we are lucky enough to kind of, have those definitions now in place. Because again, certain things might mean one thing to one person and maybe a little bit of a different thing to another person. So things that are considered Title IX sexual harassment, quid pro quo harassment, the hostile environment, and then what's called specific offenses, which are the definitions around sexual assault, dating violence, domestic violence, and stalking. So again, in policy, or in pages 1 and 2 of your aqua-colored document there, you can see a lot of those definitions. I'll now pause to see, if, as you kind of look those over, if there are any questions about any of those definitions. Okay. Secondly, and this is probably one of the larger changes into what we see in some of this new these new amendments. There has been an expansion around what kind of qualifies or what is considered that hostile environment. If you look down at the bottom under 2020, you can see what the old kind of definition was. So that was sex-based conduct that was severe, pervasive, and objectively offensive that effectively denies a person's equal access to our educational programming. A lot of very kind of clear guidelines there. In 2024, you can see that there's a lot of ors kind of added, some additional qualifiers added. And so essentially the language there is unwelcome sex-based conduct that is subjectively and objectively offensive and is so severe or pervasive that it limits or denies a person's ability to participate in or benefit from our educational programs or activities. So you can see just by reading that, there is an expansion of what might qualify under Title IX as far as that hostile environment. So essentially, when we look at this, the real outcome of this is there might be more things that qualify under this category than did before. Now, again, the difference is that, again, we were still addressing these things. We were just addressing them through a different avenue. Now these things will have to be addressed under Title IX. So that is one of the notable changes, is that expansion in kind of what that hostile environment entails. So any questions on that?
So one of the questions I had, and you touched on it, was the idea of subjectively being added and then adding in limits in addition to denies a person's ability to participate, blah, blah, blah. You mentioned that those types of things were coming up and they were being addressed, but not necessarily labeled as Title IX complaint. I'm curious if you anticipate the outcome or the potential consequences of resolving those types of issues will be different now that they will have the label of being a Title IX complaint.
Yeah,
Make sense?
that does make sense.
Yeah.
I don't necessarily anticipate that the consequences at the end of the road would be markedly different. Just because we went down the Title IX route didn't mean that the consequences were more severe than, say, we went down like the building code of conduct route or the general harassment policy. It's all really kind of specific, based on the specific situation. So I wouldn't say that just because it's Title IX means that it's a more arduous consequence.
So that the process will be different and much more prescribed.
Yes.
On the regulation.
That is correct.
Which is also changed. Thank you.
Absolutely. Any other questions on that? Okay, so the next section really is all about definitions. And so again, before we didn't have necessarily all the definitions included. Here they gave us some very specific definitions of those areas. Probably, a lot of those are pretty self-explanatory. The one I just wanted to touch on briefly was supportive measures. Supportive measures are something that the district puts into place anytime there is a Title IX matter. And we're essentially looking to make sure that both the complainant and the respondent have the supports in place to help them continue to access our programming as we're working through this investigation. So that's just a little bit about supportive measures. But again, you can kind of look at your document and look at some of those definitions.
Page 5.
Yes.
2 through 5, yep.
Thank you, Stacy.
Take Mike's mic.
Just a point of clarification, because the first time I read this, I missed this, and I caught it the second time. I'm on page 4, under education program or activity. The first time I read it, I wondered if, when it says, including activities that occur on school grounds or other property owned or occupied by the district, I wondered about other youth groups or organizations in our community using our buildings. We would not be responsible for claims. It's only school-sponsored activities, events, programming on our campuses, on our property, or events that happen off of school grounds but are still sponsored by the district.
Yeah,
Yes?
anything where we exert institutional control. All right, we can move on to the next section. The next section, and this is an ad, so they added a rather large section around pregnancy or related conditions, as far as kind of how that ties into Title IX as well. This is another area, even though they added it, our student services staff and our health staff and our teachers have done a really nice job of providing for students who may be pregnant. But this just kind of, formalizes a little bit of additional responsibility around kind of formal notification for students to make sure that they are aware of their rights related to sexual non-discrimination when it comes to pregnancy-related conditions. So again, you can kind of read through that a little bit, but.
Yeah, and there's another section for employees in pregnancy.
Yep.
And I would say our practices align to those already, but now it is another avenue potentially for an employee who could make a complaint if we weren't following our own policies. Now we have another policy in place, so it just kind of raises the bar to make sure that we are following these provisions.
Yep. And we don't have the exact logistics worked out yet on how we're going to do this, but that's coming, so.
Yeah, for the most part, those things are in place. When you talk about logistics, we're talking about making sure that notice and training is done. And we're
Yep.
going to rely on organizations to support the creation of that training. And then Mark and Nate and I and other leaders will go through that training to make sure that it aligns to what we can do.
All right, so that takes us to kind of the end of our, I'm really bad with colors, our aqua documents. That's probably not the right color, but, and now we can move on to blue. Yeah, that's a little bit aqua. We can move on to our purple or pinkish documents. Kit says it's magenta, so.
Okay.
Yes. So this is our kind of our grievance process, the process that we go through as far as Title IX. So we're going to take this kind of bullet by bullet, and you can see the page numbers that are referenced up there at the top. And again, Dave talked about this. A lot of this stuff is really kind of updates to language, some clarification. We really, as Nate, Dave, and I went through this, we did not notice or even observe anything that would be a marked change for how we do business. So again, this is just kind of some clarity around language, some flexibility that was added around kind of the roles and responsibilities, a little bit of adjustment as far as kind of when you can do that informal resolution, and we'll kind of talk through some of that. But again, just kind of use that as kind of your base as you look through this. The first thing is the notice of discrimination language there was added. So you can see that on page 1. All right, the second one is around employee expectations. Again, no changes here. Last year, Dave and I went and talked to every single staff member in the district about expectations for communicating when, you may observe these kind of things. We'll continue to do that, and we'll update that training as well. All right, the third thing is all around the assignment of the Title IX coordinator. So I am the Title IX coordinator for students. Dr. Sherman is for employees. I think there is something where you have to designate a primary Title IX coordinator, and that is me. And so again, that's just all a bit of assignments. All right, pages 3 and 4, all around duties of the Title IX coordinator. Again, as we look through this, again, nothing that we weren't already doing. Just kind of some adjusted language.
And the big picture there is that the Title IX coordinator has some responsibilities around screening the reports or complaints. And so the difference between a report is maybe somebody else is observing something, and then the Title IX coordinator is responsible for looking into that. Complaint is when someone is saying, I'm directly impacted by this. And I guess the only other big update that I would say there is just, again, that kind of continuous theme of we're moving away from sexual harassment and now talking about the bigger picture of sex discrimination.
Mm-hmm. And maybe we said this, but just so everybody's on the same page, who is our Title IX coordinator?
So Mark is the Title IX.
So Mark is our Title IX coordinator, right?
For when the complainant is a student, because he's the Director of Student Services. And then Dr. Sherman is the Title IX coordinator if the complainant is an employee.
Right.
And that's been the case. It was
Yep.
just identifying adding primary or
Yep.
secondary.
And switching out their name.
Yep.
Right. All right. The next section really is around expectations for handling a complaint. That's on pages 4 and 5. Also includes a little bit about if the student is a student with a disability, other things there. All right. And the final bullet, and I know I'm going through this kind of fast, but this is the first reading, so we certainly would welcome additional feedback. Simplification of language related to district standards and emergency removals. Again, emergency removals are all about if, Title IX in general says that until you've gone through the entire investigation process, disciplinary action is not permissible. However, there are some certain situations in where, because of the nature of the issue, we might be able to do an emergency removal to make sure that all parties are safe.
Under number 6 on page 6, says district may act to remove.
We got it.
Thank you.
Yep.
Wanted to emphasize that.
Yes.
You got it.
I really
All right. So on the top there of the next slide, again, greater detail provided for the investigation, the decision maker, dismissal, appeal process. That's all pages 9 through 14. Again, all this was really laid out in the 2020 regulations. This is really just kind of adjusting and clarifying language a little bit. No change in practice. We went through this bullet by bullet to make sure this is what we were already doing, and that was the case.
Yeah, so just to kind of call back to the 2020 regs, one of the big things there was to make sure you have a practice that is a grievance process that protects the rights of the complainant, but also the respondent. And so that some of the themes around making sure that, that we're taking actions to make sure that the respondent is innocent until proven guilty. We can't put in supportive measures that kind of put that person in a situation where they're already deemed as guilty. So I think those changes, while the regulations are clarifying some of those practices, that process is still in place. And again, that goes to the point of making sure that if you're going to go down the road of making a Title IX decision and doing sanctions based on it, that you can represent that you've followed the steps to the T. And a lot of these additional language pieces is the lawyer pulling in stuff that was in our training and saying, hey, this should just really be part of the policy.
Yeah.
Quick question. Wasn't it in 2020 the requirement that the hearing be public? And then now that has been taken away? Or did I read that wrong?
I do not.
Investigation, or is there a hearing, or do we have,
I think there's a hearing that's available. I don't think it was a public hearing.
okay.
I'd have to double check on
We'll
that.
look at that to
But
make
that's
sure.
not in our policy. There's no hearing.
No.
There's an investigation.
Well, you want to speak to that in the
Yeah.
investigation piece?
Yep, so there is an investigation. So the investigation is very thorough as far as kind of who gets interviewed, how that process works. There's a very clear delineation of when that investigation is completed, how those results are shared. There's a kind of a comment period back from the complainant and the respondent before it goes to the decision maker. So there's a very expansive process. I don't believe that there's any sort of hearing, but there is definitely opportunity for both parties to share information and make comments.
And that's the piece that I had heard was a concern with these new regulations, is that there would not be a sharing of evidence. I don't know if that's the actual word that they use, but both parties, the complainant and the respondent, will have the ability to review the evidence and the investigation, and so they will have the ability to have a fully transparent view of what's happening. So that is just something I think is important to note,
Yes.
that is still part of the process.
In our policy.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. Yeah, the main reason for the 2020 update was just to make sure that the respondent was given due process rights, because I think the idea was that there was some places that were rushing to judgment, and so this was all about kind of slowing down, making sure there's a very delineated process, and I don't see anything in the 2024 regs updates that changes that.
So just a quick editorial comment. When you pair that, which is a good thing, I guess, with the maybe expanded definition. So when we talk about implementation, that's probably the part that gives us a little bit of pause, is the idea is now we have an expanded definition of what hostile environment is, and we have a very prescribed step-by-step process. The district can work really hard to achieve that and train the appropriate people to make that. But if you were going to ask me what's the pause, I think combining those two things, a very prescribed process and a very open definition of what hostile environment is, will put us in a situation in which we're going to have to work really hard to make sure that we're staying aligned to our policies. But the next point can hopefully help a little bit with that.
Yeah, so the other kind of change is the informal resolution process. So now in past practice, we were only able to offer or even consider an informal resolution after a formal complaint was made. The new regs do allow us some more flexibility into looking into an informal resolution. Again, it has to be voluntary if there were a case where that was something that both parties sought. Now, it's important to know that this is not permissible in cases where the harassment is between an employee and a student. That's off the table. But when it's a student-student issue, this piece is a tool we could use, again, if both parties were interested. And then finally, just greater detail around, consolidation of multiple complaints, confidentiality, supportive measures. Again, no legitimate change in practice there. Oh, and I spoke to, I shouldn't have said finally. I spoke to this earlier. There is, again, that flexibility related to playing more than one role in the grievance procedures instead of just kind of being assigned a singular role. So that's going forward. Finally, and this kind of relates back to some of the handbook stuff that you guys were looking at earlier. Dr. Sherman and I were looking at some of our notices along with Dave, and one thing we noticed was we had consistency, but there was a little bit of difference as far as how we provided this notice in our various handbooks. So we wanted to make sure that we were consistent across the board in how we noticed Title IX and our anti-discrimination policies in our handbooks. So you will notice that all of them should look exactly the same now. And as we adjust our policies ever going forward, we will include those in a template for each of our buildings. And then finally, training. Training is ongoing. We haven't gotten any training from WASB yet. I assume that's coming, but once it does, we will have a large Title IX training party where all of us are able to participate in our appropriate trainings, and it will be good.
So one thing I want to stress with that is each year since 2020, we've undergone these trainings. So our Title IX coordinators have to go through a comprehensive review. If you fit the role of an investigator or a decision maker, which is a lot of our administrative team, there's an additional specialized training. If you're somebody who would engage in facilitating an informal resolution, which for us is mainly our Title IX coordinators, there's a training that goes with that. We have a training for all employees, kind of what you need to know. And this says about sexual harassment, and now it's going to be about sexual discrimination or sex non-discrimination. And then there's a special extra training for somebody who's a supervisor, principal, or somebody who, or another administrator. So essentially, even if you aren't an investigator or decision maker or Title IX coordinator, but you are a leader in the district, there's an additional set of trainings that you have. And then just kind of a summary document that we share out and face-to-face. So some of these trainings are done asynchronously, virtually, but then also there's a commitment to face-to-face conversations with employees so they understand how important it is to know these rules.
I'm just curious question. Why is it sex non-discrimination instead of sex discrimination? What's the
I'm
non
tripping
about?
over that. That's the recommendation there.
Okay.
I guess it's.
Just that's the expected behavior is
Oh,
non-discrimination.
no, that's,
The
you're stating it
positive.
positive.
Yeah.
Right.
Which makes some sense. Just seems,
I trip over it one way or the other.
yeah.
Right. Yeah, and then finally, this is my actual finally. As Dave mentioned, I think we are in a really good place. That's not to say that tomorrow we might find out that something big has happened on the legal landscape or it might cause us to need to pivot. So as information comes to us from WASB or our attorneys, we will come back to the board with adjustments or recommended changes at that point in time.
Thank you very much. That was helpful. So are there further questions or comments?
One question about the training you talked about. Is that training we design or is that training that comes from someone else?
So we will work with WASB to provide a training, but one thing that we'll always do is we won't just be like, oh, there's a training. We'll go through the training to make sure that it lines up to the language that we use and make any clarifications that are needed. So we'll use WASB to support with that training, but then Nate and Mark and I and other administrators will look at it to make sure that it syncs up and is appropriate.
Okay, so there are guidelines on how to do this
Correct.
so that we know that, because later on, someone could say, well, I was never trained in this. I mean, they can always say that, but I mean, we're being careful in working with WASB to make sure we're covering all the bases.
Yeah, I think one additional step we did last year was just that idea of making sure we didn't just rely on asynchronous virtual trainings, but also kind of have that face-to-face. So.
Okay.
Anything else? At this point, I will make the motion to approve the first reading of revised school board policy 411.11, Title IX, the title, actually, that should really change because the new title is going to be sex non-discrimination complaint procedures, as well as the rule. Yes. But
Just
right
sorry,
here.
So I'll just say it, and then the rule is policy 411.11 rule, Title IX, sex non-discrimination. The policy is policy 411.11, Title IX, sex non-discrimination.
Right, which is not what we
Yeah,
have
that's-
here. That's why
yep,
I'm reading it,
yep.
so that the correct titles are on the blue and purple pages. I've made that motion. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you. Further discussion? This is complicated. Thank you to Mark and to Dave for walking us through this. I think that you brought clarity to a very complicated situation. I'm suspecting that this is not going to be the last time that we have this before us, even though we do have a second reading. But my experience is that the school board is not anxious to be on the wrong side of the law. So we do need to muddle through the complication to be able to make sure that we're in compliance, which is why we're doing this. Anything else?
Well, I have one mundane question.
Sure.
People might be curious. I was curious in the states where this is not applicable because there's ongoing lawsuits. Does anybody understand the nature of those lawsuits? Are they
It has to do with the,
alleged perpetrators? No? Okay.
it has to do with the language of the definition of sex
Broadening.
and the definition of sex.
Okay.
To include gender identity,
Identity.
orientation.
Okay.
Sex-based stereotypes, non-conforming sex roles.
Yeah, okay,
I think I'm saying that right. That's the big point.
okay.
But that, again, to make sure that everybody's really clear about that, that does not include Wisconsin. We are not enjoined
school
so
district
far.
is not
The school
enjoined.
district. Right. The school district of River Falls is not enjoined in that ruling. All right. Anything else? All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? The motion is carried, and it will come back in August for a second reading. At this point, we are going to turn to approve the second reading of the new school board policy for 342, Programs for Children with Disabilities. At the last meeting in June, the board went through this, so this is the second reading. Is there a motion, please?
So moved.
Thank you, Allison.
Second.
Thank you, Ellen. Questions or comments? All those in favor? Aye. Opposed? The motion is carried. H, we are not ready to do that. That is going to be postponed until we're ready. So we are going to move on to I. Are there any proposed or suggested items for future regular board meeting agendas? All right, then we are going to move on to some scheduling. Educational Program Committee will meet Monday, August 5th at 6 o'clock. Finance and Facilities will meet Monday, August 12th at 6 o'clock. And the Personnel Committee will meet Monday, August 12th at 7 o'clock or immediately following the Finance and Facilities Committee. Those meetings are held here. The next regular board meeting will be Monday, August 19th at 6 o'clock. That
Stacy.
meeting,
Sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah.
Just one time thing.
okay?
We're going to do finance and facilities at 7, and we're going to do personnel at 6. We're flip-flopping those based on some availability of board members.
On the 12th?
On the 12th.
That's right.
Okay, so we're starting-
Everything's on the same day.
We're
It's
starting with
yep.
personnel, and then F and F will go following.
Yep.
All right, everybody get that?
And will we have enough people there? I might be a little late to that meeting,
To personnel.
to personnel on the
So
12th.
who's on personnel? I'm
You
on
and
there.
Alan.
You're on there. You're going to be there, right?
All right.
You two are. So
You're going to be there, right?
You'll be there. So if I'm a little bit late. Okay.
I'll pick you up. All right. So you will join us as soon as you can then.
Yes.
And we will proceed. That's good.